All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Tax Talk Live, broadcast by the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Apologize for being a little bit late. We're having some technical difficulties, but hopefully you're hearing us loud and clear right now. I'm Jordan Bateman. I'm the British Columbia Director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, and I'm joined, as always, by our fantastic Alberta Director, Paige McPherson. How you doing, Pager?
Doing well. Glad we got through those technical difficulties. I'm going to talk about some fun stuff today.
Yes, but Paige, the big news here in British Columbia is there is snow falling in Greater Vancouver again.
It sounds just awful. The rest of the country is weeping for you. We're all very concerned.
Yeah, what has happened to us in Vancouver? We used to be like, by now we'd be posting pictures of tulips and us out on the golf course and, rubbing the nose of some poor Regina schmuck for, still having to, shovel and whatnot. But, it's not the same anymore. I don't know. It's a crazy world we live in.
Is it at least a bit sunny?
No. No, it's terrible. It's terrible. Anyways, my apologies to those of you who live in real winter conditions for the whining you're going to hear from Greater Vancouver for the next few days. However, just to let you know what we're doing here, this is our Tax Talk Live podcast. We are broadcasting this live through Facebook Live. So if you're watching us on there, feel free to leave a comment. Just so you're aware, there is about a 10-second delay for Paige and I. We're in the future, so we don't see your comments until a few moments after you post them, but we're going to do our best to handle that time jump. We were hoping to have Christine Van Geyen with us. She's our fantastic Ontario director. Unfortunately, tech issues have prevented that from happening, but we're going to talk a little bit about property taxes, a little bit about, of course, carbon taxes, and then a little bit about the idea of Calgary hosting a future Winter Olympics and whether that's a great idea for taxpayers. Just so you know, we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan advocacy organization. All we do is work on three things: lower taxes, less waste, more government accountability. That drives all the communications, research, and advocacy work we do. You can connect with us here on Facebook or on Twitter at Jordan Bateman or at Paige McP. And you can also visit our website, taxpayer.com. You can see what we're all working on. All right, Paige, what do you want to talk about? What's new?
Well, I was going to talk about what's new related to the Olympics in Calgary, but I'm going to save that because it's going to be related to what we're talking about. So I'll tell you about something that we did this week. We released our pre-budget submission to the government. So, okay, it's a long document, very numbers heavy, not that exciting. But we do have some kind of shocking situation going on, I think, when you actually look at the numbers in Alberta right now. When it comes to debt. So we're currently spending $1 billion a year on debt interest payments. And that's going to double to $2 billion a year by 2018-19. So we're going to be just, lighting that money on fire. It's not going to have any real benefit for taxpayers. And the province's debt is now $28.4 billion. So, it's racking up at a really rapid pace. We've been impacted by the oil prices, but the government is continuing to create new programs like government daycare. They're spending more money. More and more. They're hiring new government employees. They hired almost 3,500 new government employees this past fiscal year. So, there's a real, I think, disconnect between what Alberta families and businesses are doing in terms of trying to balance their own budgets and what the government is doing, which really seems, I think, tone deaf when it comes to reality. But here's the craziest thing is that Alberta, we eliminated our debt in 2004. We had no debt whatsoever. So for every other province, you have to dig yourself out of this hole. We had a Premier, Ralph Klein, who actually did dig ourselves out of this hole. And we've just between the PCs and the NDP government now, we've just gotten ourselves way back into this hole. And it's a really unfortunate situation because the government does not seem to be doing anything about it.
It's a great point. I was actually talking to Stockwell Day about a year ago, and he was telling me about oil prices and working with Ralph Klein. And he, as a treasurer, finance minister for Alberta, he once went to Premier Klein and said, "Ralph, if we could just get oil to $25 a barrel, we're golden. We'll be rolling in dough." And, here these guys in quote unquote downturn, and they're still getting about $50 or $45 a barrel. And they still can't make ends meet. I can't believe Alberta, debt-free for a few years, almost $30 billion in debt. That's it kind of boggles the mind. British Columbia, to give you context, Campbell was busy paying down debt in the first part of the 2000s. He actually got the debt down to about $33 billion in 2007. Now, unfortunately, we're at about $65 billion. We're headed towards 70. these guys, like, they were so close, they were on the right path. They were going to be able to use that interest money for other things. And instead they've let it all slide away.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I mean, and oftentimes they'll compare Alberta to other provinces and say, oh, it's nothing. Our debt is so small. But you have to remember, we got rid of that debt. So it's pretty unbelievable that we're back to this situation. It is depressing when you've got a government that's on the right path, and then the next government, completely messes it up, which is really, even Ralph Klein at the end of his term started spending money again, and too much money again at unsustainable levels. But we're going to reach a record high in spending in 2018-19. So spending more than we ever did. So the problem is just getting, it's getting worse and worse and worse. Our debt's rolling in at $355 a second. It's really, I don't understand why the government is continuing to introduce new government programs at this time. It's the worst thing you could do is, continue to expand the spending and expand the size of government. And it's really strange because you've got this sort of doublespeak thing going on where they're talking about how they're, finding efficiencies, which just means they're not spending as much as they had initially wanted to. They're still increasing spending, and how they're, they're not going to balance the budget on the back of vulnerable Albertans and cut nurses and teachers, as if anybody would care if, we would hire more nurses and teachers. If we need more nurses and teachers, by all means, go forward and hire those people. We have upticks in enrollment in schools, hire more teachers. The problem is that you can't continue to hire other bureaucrats to administer these programs that we don't need at the same time. You're going to have to cut from somewhere if you want to spend somewhere else. So it's frustrating. So, we submitted our pre-budget submission to government. It's over 50 pages long. We've got a lot of different ideas for spending cuts. So we'll see if they hear us out. I mean, governments in the past in Alberta actually really have heard out the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. So we'll see.
Yeah. The scary thing about that is, I mean, there are some economic arguments that people make for spending money on infrastructure during downtimes.
Right, which we're doing.
Which you're doing. But this is, there's a lot of debts for programs. Like, it's not for things that will last. It really is about borrowing, taking out a mortgage in order to buy groceries. It's, the day-to-day, not something that's going to last for the long term. So
it's true. And that actually kind of links to the Olympics talk that we're going to be talking about. When it comes to infrastructure spending, the idea that you're going to spend on infrastructure as a job creation measure, that's not why we should be spending on infrastructure, right? We should spend on infrastructure if we need a road, when we can afford it. That's the bottom line. It's that's why we should be spending, not to create jobs, because they're not sustainable jobs. They're paid for by the government, and those are the only types of jobs really being created in Alberta right now. It's not sustainable. Let's get to a question quickly before we switch gears. So Bill is asking if we would support a genuine carbon tax if it was truly tax neutral, stayed in the province of origin, and was not on top of regulatory diktats, such as the mandatory early phase out of coal. So my initial thought to that is, there's no realistic situation in which the government is going to eliminate all environmental regulations and just impose a carbon tax. So I don't think that's, something that's going to happen. It's definitely not something that's going to happen in Alberta. They talk about the carbon tax as a mechanism of the market, and yet they impose all of these sort of dictatorial regulations on top of it, which means they don't actually have much faith in this market mechanism. But I think maybe, Jordan, you can talk to the whole sort of tax neutral argument, because, it's being sold as revenue neutral in BC.
Yeah, look, revenue neutrality in BC, it's neutral for government. Sorry, I'm just getting an echo here. But it's not neutral for the taxpayer. So, funnily enough, John Horgan of the BC NDP, they came out with their climate plan yesterday. So there's a May 9th provincial election. This is kind of his environmental plank. And in it, they talk about going along with Trudeau's increase to $50 a ton. Right now, it's $30 a ton. But giving back most of that money in quote unquote rebates. Now, the rebates are an interesting idea. I asked a question on Twitter, wouldn't it be more efficient just to not collect the tax rather than collecting a tax just to hand it back in rebates? I got a one-word answer from some, random backbencher MLA opposition member. No. Well, pardon me, but actually, yes.
Yes.
Obviously not collecting the tax, and then having to have a bureaucracy to cut checks to send to everyone. Yeah. Obviously, that would be a lot more efficient. But
right.
Okay. The other funny thing about the NDP's new plan in BC is They rip Christy Clark for not doing enough for not doing the right thing on increasing the carbon tax because she's frozen it for 5 years. They rip her for handing up some of that money to corporate entities, but they don't propose to change that. So $500 million of the carbon tax money goes to the film industry. The film industry claims that's for jobs here in BC. Of course, you watch Disney and Universal and Fox make massive profits, and a lot of that money is coming from British Columbia taxpayers. Mm-hmm. I got excited when John Horgan gets up and says, we've got to quit giving carbon tax money to crony capitalism and in corporate welfare. Great, start with the film industry, but no, they're going to keep Clark's whole system entirely the same, just increase it. So, here they claim the carbon tax isn't helping with reduced greenhouse gas emissions, which it's not. They're correct on that. But, they don't actually want to change the way the current tax is being handled. So it shows you just kind of how circular the logic is for those guys. For me, look, simpler is better. The carbon tax, it's not accomplishing the goal that it was set out for, which is to lower greenhouse gas emissions. If a tax policy is not meeting the goal, then it's just a revenue grab. And, if a tax policy does not meet the goal set out for it, it should be scrapped because it's not, an efficient use of government resources. So that would be my point on the carbon tax.
Yeah, and we've had 2 more comments while you've been talking. One from Andy saying that it's nothing but a liberal tax grab, the carbon tax, saying it does nothing here in Canada. Similar comment from Doug saying it would amount to beans in terms of reducing our carbon footprint whatsoever. So yeah, I mean, that's the point. It's not achieving the goal that it's set out to do, right? We don't, in my opinion, have a large enough carbon footprint to make a difference, to make a dent in global climate change. So, if we're going to make Canadians poorer, I'm not really seeing the benefit of doing that because there isn't a big environmental benefit. And the other thing is, I don't know how you could guarantee that it would be truly, tax neutral for every taxpayer. Because everybody consumes carbon differently. Rural Albertans, as an example, British Columbians, Canadians everywhere are going to, they have more carbon intensive lifestyles by virtue of where they live. They tend to be farmers who also feed our cities. So there's perks to having them live out there. So I'm not, I don't know how you could actually guarantee that, but it's, an interesting question. So anyway, Jordan, what's new with you? Oh, sorry. Go on.
Well, and if you start cutting taxes for a carbon tax, and then let's say you actually get lucky and carbon is reduced, what happens then? You're going to have to increase taxes somewhere else again. So it doesn't really make sense. The other part of carbon taxation is the people who are really pushing it do not act like the world is in the kind of crisis they claim it is. If the world was really in that kind of crisis, they would be acting a whole lot differently than taking private planes places. And
would Jane Fonda be flying over the oil sands?
Yeah, no, exactly. So you can convince me a lot better if I see real sacrifice coming from Justin Trudeau in his personal life rather than just fobbing off a tax on the rest of us. So
yeah, or Alberta ministers with their big gas guzzling luxury SUVs, if they start all taking their bikes everywhere. All right, no, that's for sure. Then maybe you can tell Alberta. All right, so what's new with you?
Well, before I get to my what's new, I want to ask an Alberta politics question. What's been the reaction to Brian Jean's announcement that he would step down and run in a Unite the Right ticket or for the a Unity leadership race?
So I think it's mixed. I mean, in terms of, I think the Unite the Right movement, I think that they are pretty happy with this because it shows, I guess the other big option for Brian Jean was, no, we don't need to unite. We don't need any of the sort of any PC people to come over. We don't need Jason Kenney to be involved in this at all. We can win the election on our own. And if they had said that and they had tried to say that, there have been some polls that have said, yes, they can win the election on their own. Other people are more skeptical. I have no idea. But either way, that wouldn't have been a very good thing for the Unite the Right. It would have posed a big challenge for them if the leader of the Wildrose did not want to do that. That said, there's probably, I'm guessing, he said he had consulted with his members, so I'm guessing there was a pretty big push from inside the Wildrose to of members saying, no, we should unite the right. It's the best way to beat the NDP. So positive from their side. There's been the same kind of, Twitter is just an awful place, the same kind of political infighting that's been going on the Alberta legislature feed for months now. Which is pretty ridiculous. But Yeah, I mean, I guess it's positive for the Unite the Right people. Does anybody have you heard any thoughts outside of the province of Alberta, our drama soap opera going on in our
Well,
politics?
just here's what I love. So before, when Kenny first announces, all the pundits poo-poo his chances. Oh, you can't possibly take over and whatnot. But he's tweeting out results from these delegate meetings, and it looks like a foregone conclusion. Kenny's going to win this thing in a landslide. So the more the experts talk this thing down, the more likely it is to happen. And I think Wild Rosers have that kind of anti-establishment feel, anyways. And the best thing that can happen is for the Edmonton Journal and the Globe and Mail and the Toronto Star to write stories about how it could never happen. So
it's true.
Yeah, I'm all for it. So
so what I would say as well is, like, there are talks now. There was an article about how Elections Alberta is saying that the merger is not possible. So there's different sort of technical hurdles that come up all the time, and I don't understand the party system maybe well enough to know what's right and what's wrong. But I think maybe Jason Kenney's camp probably did their homework to see some sort of an avenue they could go through. But there are these hurdles that come up all the time, so they certainly have barriers being thrown in their way.
Yeah, well, they can always just dissolve both parties, form a new one, but as part of that new one, absorb in the memberships of the old ones. I mean,
But then they can't keep their money. They can't keep their. So Brian Jean wants to keep the establishment of the Wild Rose so that they can keep, I think, the legal framework of the Wild Rose so they can keep their money. Because all this money that they've fundraised. So there's issues like that.
That'd be great, though. Then you can get rid of the PC debt, just dissolve and go bankrupt.
Right. That's true.
That's one way to get around the PC debt. We are not advocating. All right, so my what's new, I think, is probably near and dear to our hearts, Paige, as old reporters. Another round of big media cuts in Vancouver, 20 TV and radio, newspaper, 26 people leaving Vancouver Sun and Vancouver Province, including some of the, some really top-notch reporters. I mean, Howard Sumera is a big amateur sports reporter out here. He left. Jeff Lee, the longtime Vancouver City Hall beat reporter for the Sun, has left. A number of other just really stellar people. And then, cuts at television stations. Colleen Christie, a longtime anchor, very well respected here at CTV Vancouver. She was cut. Even on our radio stations, sports radio cut the voice of the BC Lions and the voice of the Vancouver Whitecaps. And just a terrible time for media. And, I know it's fun sometimes for people to bash the mainstream media, but man, like, you've got to have someone covering this stuff. And, when you think of 5 years ago, 10 years ago, there was 30 sports reporters in town, and now there's 7. That's just sports. The same thing's happening in legislative galleries and newspaper at city halls. Really a tough time for our friends in the media.
It is. And I mean, there were cuts at McLean's as well just a couple days ago. I think they cut 11 people. So there have been cuts, like across the country. It seems like you can't go a month without hearing of more cuts, whether they're in a specific province or for a national outlet. And I agree with you. I mean, people do like to rag on the media party or the mainstream media, but so many people play such an important role. Of course, there's bias. Of course, some people are biased, and that's just how it is. And interestingly, I think we're seeing the emergence of more opinion-based news outlets as a result of this. I mean, we're seeing a lot of non-traditional stuff, but it's this weird purgatory stage, right? Where, mainstream media is becoming an increasingly difficult place to work, and people are getting laid off, and people are going towards other professions. There was an article written in the Edmonton Journal the other day about how there's been this exodus of Alberta former reporters going and working as press secretaries for the NDP. Questions, about, is it coincidental that they've all gone to this sort of left-leaning party? But really, I don't know if it is, because I wonder, is it just, timing? Like, it's a really difficult time to be a journalist right now. I left being, a journalist. I left reporting to do this job, which is really fun, and we still get to do a lot of media stuff. But ultimately, I decided, it's not a very sustainable career. I wanted to work in advocacy anyway, so it was sort of the right time to make the jump. And I think a lot of people are thinking that too. So it's really interesting now, actually, when you're at the legislature on budget day, as an example. When I started out in Alberta in the spring of 2015, being in the legislature in the scrum, I met all the reporters. I was new, and you saw all these reporters in the scrums. And now, if I'm in the legislature on budget day, I literally sometimes don't know who's a reporter and who is actually a press secretary, because it's a lot of the same people who are there, but some of them have tape recorders because they're recording you for their minister or whatever, and some of them have a microphone or a similar looking tape recorder because they're recording it for media. And it's actually difficult to tell who's who now, because there has been this really big exodus. But it's a weird time in media. I don't know if we also see the government kind of starting to, I think, overstep their bounds, like the Trudeau government saying, what can we do to help control for fake news, which sounds like censorship to me, asking about, how can we maybe help out media, prop them up. So there might be maybe subsidies down the road for somebody other than CBC. I don't know. It's a strange time, and ultimately, I think it's depressing.
Yeah, it is depressing. And the thing I want people to really understand is, yes, you can be upset with the general bias of the media. From time to time, I am as well. But these are real people feeding families. Just because they're on TV doesn't mean they don't have, real concerns and a real mortgage and all that stuff. So it's important that, we realize that the frontline reporters are the ones who are bearing the brunt for some of the stupid decisions and lack of adaptability by their bosses. I do not favor subsidies for media. I think it's stupid. It's not what we should be paying for. I look forward to seeing more grassroots media emerge. Bring on the Rebels of the world, and let's see more of those kind of models, the Candalands, things like that. But yeah, spare a thought for those people who are making tough decisions. Moving on, you talked about going on to be press secretaries, not just press secretaries. Here in BC, two prominent global TV reporters, Steve Darling, Jas Johal, both running for the BC Liberals in the next election. Wow. They have a trusted brand because you've seen them on TV. I mean, Steve Darling, everyone loved him on the morning shows. And they'll probably Jas Johal for sure will win. Steve's in a bit of a tougher riding, but I would bet on him to win as well. So interesting to see those people now migrate into government, not just on the staff side, but on the politics side as well.
It's interesting. I think it's a similar skill set. So
talking.
Yeah, pretty much talking, but answering who, what, when, why kind of questions. And I mean, media is more about cutting through the BS. Politics is more about smearing on the BS. But still, it's kind of a similar skill set there. And I agree with what you're saying. I mean, in my experience, and I've worked with reporters across the country because I covered elections. And so I was on the bus for 6 or 4 weeks at a time with people and got to know them really well. And most people really don't have any sort of axe to grind. Most people are not, really biased and trying to get across their message. There are people like that, as I'm sure there are in every profession, but I don't think it's the norm. And a lot of people now, because the jobs are so low paying and so demanding in terms of your workload, are young people who really just want to get their start. So that was my experience. Even though, I mean, I understand why people get frustrated, but I'll just put that out there.
Yeah. And look, if if you enjoy some online media, subscribe to it. There's lots of different places. Candaland, for example, I don't agree with everything they say, but the many patrons crowdfunded, not taking government money to do it. The Rebel obviously has thousands of supporters. Good on them. But if you're reading a local blog on Langley politics or wherever you live, and there's an option to throw the guy a tip or a PayPal donation, do it. Support these guys. It's important that we get into the habit of making sure that we pay for the things that are important. So
I agree.
Voluntarily rather than through taxes.
I get 2 newspapers to my house every morning, so and they're kind of the same now. So
I'm a press reader guy, and I gotta admit it's tough when you read. I read the Sun, the Province, the National Post, and 24 hours every day on that press reader app. Often I'm reading the same story 4 times.
I know, it's true. So yeah, I understand why people are cutting back their subscriptions.
That's me. All right, you wanted to talk about the Olympics, but we also want to talk about deregulation. Which one do you want to do first?
Let's talk about the Olympics.
Okay.
Because I want to tell my thing about this what's new that I was going to tell. So here in Calgary, they're considering putting in a bid for the Olympics, and I think that this is absurd personally, because I mean, look at Calgary's economic situation. We've got a lot of bad stuff going on. Our unemployment rate is over 10%. We've got, people really, really struggling to pay their property tax bills. And just generally, it's very evident that, things are not good. We don't have a lot of extra cash lying around. And of course, having the Olympics costs money. So the argument is that, well, maybe it could generate money and we could have all these excellent economic gains from having the Olympics there. As they talk about that and they tend to stress that argument. So there are other sort of arguments that can be made for hosting the Olympics. It's sort of city pride thing, put your city on the map, all of these kinds of a little bit more dubious, but I think arguments that probably actually hold more water than the economic argument when you actually break it down and look at the studies. So we've got this committee now in Calgary looking at the option of hosting the Olympics. And this committee, which is volunteer, hired 11 staff members to try and help them with their decision as to, they're doing research as to whether or not we should host an Olympic bid. And these 11 staff members, we don't know who they are. We don't know how they were hired. We don't know anything about the hiring process. We don't know what the salaries are. We don't know who's getting paid what and for what amount of work. And none of these details are actually public or are, transparent to the taxpayers who are paying these salaries. And so our mayor, Nenshi, was asked about it. And he said, that he's surprised by their excuse. The committee's excuse is that, the staff had not agreed to disclose this information and they're not comfortable with it, so they're not going to. So he's going to, look into it. As far as I'm concerned, I mean, you're the mayor. You should demand it. I think that you probably have the power to do that. You're taking money from the city budget that, taxpayers are paying that are going to these people's salaries. And it is just the strangest thing that we can't find out who these people are, what they're being paid, why they were hired. I mean, there are some obvious, I think, potential interests that people want to know about. I have no idea if this is a play at all, but, we've got a group of people here that wants to build an NHL arena to benefit their own, the owners basically of the Calgary Flames. We are very much against that form of corporate welfare, but if there was an Olympics and we needed a new arena, well, that would fit really nicely with that desire, right? So even if that's not at play at all, which maybe it's not, I think people really have a lot of interest in knowing who these people are and why, what they're getting paid and why these are the specific people trying to make this decision. And yet, crickets, it's very weird.
When you, not that I do this, but I'm told you lay a floor in a house and you got to make sure the first row is perfect because the second row builds on that and the third row, and otherwise it just gets more and more crooked as you go along.
I'll go with it. No experience, but yeah.
No experience either. I'm told this is a thing. The very first, when your very first impulse is for secrecy on like week one of your committee, that's a bad sign for taxpayers down the road, because that's just going to become worse and worse. You're actually weaving it into the DNA of what you're doing instead of being open and accountable and honest. And look, there are benefits to having the Olympics. I'm a Vancouver guy, love the Olympics. Transformative experience for my kids. I helped run a torch relay stop in Langley. Loved every moment of those Olympics. But it was very, very expensive. It added quite a bit to the debt of British Columbia. There was a definite cost to it, and you've got to weigh both. And you got to be honest about both. Yeah. The other thing I fear for Calgary is that'll be coming off 2 Asian Winter Olympics, and the Asian countries are nuts when it comes to spending money on the Olympics. The incredible overruns with the Beijing Summer Olympics are a great example. Just throwing money off a cliff, and billions and billions. I think the Summer Olympic budget in Beijing was something like 2 or 3 times more than any other Summer Olympic budget ever was. Yeah. You can't possibly keep up with that, but the pressure will be there. These things never get smaller, right? They always want to be bigger than the last one, and that would be the pressure for Calgary. But ultimately, it's a calculation these individual taxpayers have to make. In Vancouver, the public was asked, the public voted and approved it. Hopefully, Calgary would do the same thing. Ask their residents if this is really where they want their tax money being spent, because it will be billions of dollars, and projects that benefit the Olympics will be advanced and greenlit ahead of projects that maybe are more important for the long-term sustainability of the community.
Exactly. I did not know that Vancouver residents were asked about that. That's really interesting. And you make a good point about how the Olympics have gotten more grandiose and year after year. And that's actually an argument that's being made in Calgary. Is when we hosted the Olympics before, the Winter Olympics, I think it was 1988. It was one of the most fiscally responsible Olympics ever held. The cost overruns, I don't remember if there even were cost overruns. It was really, I think, hailed as a pinnacle of fiscal responsibility when it comes to the Olympics. But that was then, and this is now. So not only have the Olympics become more grandiose, and you've got these countries that are their government's a little more obsessed with making their image, perfect to the outside world, that you have to compete with, or else your Olympics are going to look lame or whatever. But also the security concerns are completely different. Yeah. I mean, we've got a climate right now where we're seeing major terrorist events happen corresponding with other events like the Boston Marathon. Terrorism concerns are heightened in the world for good reason, I think. And so that's a huge cost concern. I mean, the security costs alone are so much greater than they would have been in 1988. And so I think that's something that when Calgary is arguing, oh, well, we did this before, we can be so fiscally responsible, you're looking at a lot of different kinds of costs that you weren't looking at before.
Yeah, exactly. And the mayor of Calgary in the 88 Olympics was a guy named Ralph Klein. And
right.
it ain't Ralph Klein running Calgary these days. So
right.
Ralph knew how to say no to things. I'm not sure Nenshi ever has, except possibly Uber. Didn't he say no to them? I seem to recall that. But yeah, Bob Mackin, an investigative reporter here, wrote a great book called Red Mittens and Red Ink. Where no one better on the planet at digging into IOC spending and Olympic spending than Bob Mackin. It's worth a download. bobmackin.com. So take a look at that. It'll tell you a lot about the behind the scenes machinations that go on at Olympic Games. 88 was, you're right, a very, very long time ago. And it's a very expensive venture now, far more than it was back in the 80s.
Yeah.
By the way, you also had a lot more media there watchdogging every expenditure.
That's very true. That's a really good point. Luckily we've got some, local economists who are really speaking out about this. Based on my experience, economists really don't like the idea of hosting the Olympics based on economic gains. So they'll say, great, maybe it's a city building thing. Maybe residents are really behind it. A vote would be a great way to gauge that. But at the end of the day, you shouldn't think that you're going to have these massive economic gains with very little costs to you. The costs almost always outweigh the benefits when they've done studies looking at different Olympics that have been held across the world. And in a lot of cases, they really leave countries in shaky or countries or cities are in shaky economic conditions. So I'm glad that we have those people speaking out. But I think we have to add our voice now, because this whole committee thing, not knowing the staff we're starting out on a sketchy note, as you say. Our floor will not be steady.
Yes, exactly. Hey, and then you and I were talking offline about deregulation. You're impressed by a Donald Trump executive order of all things.
Yes. Well, I think that I've heard a lot from different groups, taxpayer groups in the United States, and business groups saying that red tape is a big problem, being weighed down in regulation, which is a similar concern, that we've had in Canada. Groups like the Canadian Federation of Independent Business always raise awareness about how we've got so much red tape, and it's a real struggle for businesses, especially small businesses. So Donald Trump, in one of his executive orders, said that they are, for every new regulation that comes in, we're going to cut 2 regulations, which I just think is a great idea, because so many of these things, so many government policies that are put in, I think should be put in with sunset clause. Let's examine this at a later date and see if it's actually valuable, see if it's actually working. And government never seems to do that. So our tax codes and our laws and our books of regulations just get longer and longer and longer and longer. And there are some, ridiculous cases of different regulations that are on the books. So I'm sure there's a ton of cobwebs that can be swept out. And I think that that's a great executive order, if you ask me.
Yeah. Well, here in BC, we did this in the early 2000s. Gordon Campbell was elected in 2001, and he promised to cut regulations, 30%, I think, 1/3 of all regulations he was going to cut. And he put a young minister in charge, Kevin Falcon, who would later become health and finance minister. His first job was Minister of State for Deregulation. And the first year and a half, he just got nothing but abuse from the media because very little happened. And the truth was, he was so busy counting the darn regulations, hundreds of thousands of regulations. You can't cut them until you know how many you have, right? They finally got the count, and then progress stalled. They were making very little progress at convincing ministers to cut regulations. So at kind of the midpoint of the term, Falcon sits down with Campbell. And Kevin has told me this story. I don't think I'm telling tales out of school, but Kevin talks to the premier and says, "Look, I want to get this done, but the ministers aren't doing it." And he said, "Okay, here's what I want. At the end of every cabinet meeting, Kevin, you're going to report out to all of cabinet how many regulations each ministry has cut that week or that month." Great. So there's a chart at the bottom of every single cabinet meeting, and it showed, the Ministry of Health, total regulations cut. So, let's say they have 540,000 regulations cut 3. And sure enough, it became a political embarrassment. And Campbell would jump on these ministers and say, "Why haven't you made any progress in cutting any of your regulations?" And of course, the ministers would go back to their offices and scream at their deputy ministers who do the real work, saying, "Why the hell aren't we cutting enough regulations?" And sure enough, slowly but surely, they started whittling these down, and they actually did cut more than a third. Even the press, who are skeptical of the whole thing, confirmed, fact-checked it. Yep, a third of these regulations have been repealed and are gone. And even today, there's a one-for-one deal now in BC, where if you bring in a new regulation, you have to cut one somewhere in your ministry. So it just takes that political push, and it'll be up to President Trump and the cabinet to make sure that they're pushing for those regulations to be cut. Otherwise, it's just words on paper. So.
Interesting. Wow. And that's still on the books in BC today. That's impressive.
Yeah, it's a big thing. And that's why BC every single year wins the CFIB's, Golden Scissors Award or whatever. Now, the funny thing is, it's gotten a little nuts here in BC, where they were so proud of their red tape cutting that they actually announced that they brought in a red tape cut day. The government did, they passed a law in the legislature saying such and such a date in February is red tape awareness day or something, ridiculous. Bringing in a regulation about how you're cutting regulations was a bit nonsensical. However, we do appreciate the commitment to cutting red tape, and it's something that every level of government, the feds, right down to your smallest village, should be looking at. Do we need these rules, and is there another way to get this done?
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I remember when there was the Ontario PC campaign, I think it was 2011, they were proposing having I think it was a minister of red tape, and cutting red tape. That would be his goal. And I thought it was funny to sort of, create a new ministry to cut red tape and to, I guess reduce the size of government. But I, guess somebody has to do it. All right.
Yeah, you have to have that political person who's responsible, right?
True. Yeah. I guess you got to hold somebody responsible. I'm just going to get to a few of these comments because we've had a lot. So somebody talking about, our tax dollars going to interest payments that get us nothing. Completely agree. We were talking about that at the start of the chat. Alberta is set to spend $2 billion a year on interest payments. I think Ontario is now spending $1 billion a month or something crazy. Oh, so, so I think it's, it's up there. Don't quote me on that number. We can check back with Christine Van Gyn, but I know that their debt is substantially larger. So debt interest payments are a huge deal. They suck also for credit downgrades. We've had our credit downgraded multiple times in Alberta, and that means that, it might be more expensive for us to borrow for programs and healthcare education, stuff like that down the road. So that's concerning. Just talking about, Canada. So Wyman here, Canada is 46% covered with trees. We're actually carbon negative. Yeah, that's an argument, I don't know that much about. I don't know that much about the science side of things. I'm certainly not an expert there, but I know that it's been an argument made by farmers. For example, the Western Canadian Wheat Growers Association, talking about how a lot of the farms now, because of innovations they've made on their own farms to save money and help the environment, but also just the fact that they have so much grain there, they're actually carbon sinks. So I think that's interesting. Jordan, do you have anything to say about this house flipping capital gains tax? Scott has been asking about it, and Tim, I don't know much about it.
Yeah, I remember I've talked to Woody about this before. I'm going to take that question on notice.
Yeah, okay. We can look into it.
Yeah,
we'll look into it. But thank you guys for the question. So Stuart and Debbie.
Oh, sorry.
I just got one more here. I'll read one more. Stuart and Debbie, been following CTF for a long time, which has been really informative. Thank you for that. So question is, how can the rest of Canadians who feel overwhelmed by government tax grabs, how can we organize, really prove our distrust in government programs? Recently retired. So, I mean, it's great that you've been following us. I think that, well, we certainly are probably, I think, the most prominent of nonprofit group when it comes to this kind of stuff about certainly about taxation and government regulation, government lack of accountability and overspending. So we are expanding all the time. We've got over 90,000 supporters now. We're truly national now that we actually are in Quebec as well. So I think, continue. I hate to give a shameless plug, but continue supporting groups like ours. And if you have ideas for us of issues that are really grinding your gears, we're always open. So you can always send us an email, ideas for a petition or whatever it might be an issue that for us to look at. So you can always give us a shout.
Yeah, also go to taxpayer.com. On the right-hand side, you'll see a place where you can get action updates. This is really important to people like Paige and I, because sometimes we come up to an issue where we know if we could just shake a few emails or phone calls or some type of action that the politicians will buckle and change. We use that list quite a bit, but only when necessary. And over and over again, through different campaigns, we found it to be very successful, a way for you to get your voice heard, and a way for us to use kind of the clout we have of being such a large organization now with so many people across Canada, using that clout to affect change at the precise moment we need to.
For sure.
Got a waste of the week there, Paige?
All right, so I've got a quick waste of the week. I need more information on this, but I've called our Environment Minister, Shannon Phillips' office about 5 times now, and I've not gotten a clear answer. But essentially, she's from Lethbridge, but every one of the ministers and MLAs have a place in Edmonton. That's where the legislature is, so they rent an apartment or whatever it is. They have got housing there that's paid for by taxpayers. And she, for some reason, when we were looking through her expense claims, had an expense claim for a hotel in Edmonton. And it was near the airport. And the reason given was that she had an early morning flight for a meeting somewhere in Ottawa or something. And so that's why she stayed near the airport. So I think it's pretty ridiculous, and I'm not quite sure why our environment minister would have housing in Edmonton, but then would still rent a hotel room in Edmonton just so that she could be closer to the airport, maybe to leave for an early morning flight. There's lots of taxpayers who fly on a regular basis, and frankly, they stay in their home beds, and then they go to the airport. So that's the waste of the week. I'm hoping her office gives me a clear answer on that soon, but nothing yet.
Even Connor McDavid would, stay in his own house and then fly out early in the morning. Even he doesn't need a hotel room next to him.
There you go.
There you go. He's the only Edmontonian I know, so there you are.
Yeah. Yeah.
All right. Well, that's awesome. Hey, thanks for doing this, Paige. Thanks for watching, listening to this episode of Tax Talk. Do us a favor, leave us a comment in the Facebook. And if you're downloading this on iTunes, feel free to give us a good rating, because we are like the 19th rated podcast in government and organizations, which does nothing but amuse Paige and I to no end. So that's very important. And again, you can follow our work at taxpayer.com, and please sign up in the action updates section, because that's an important thing. And thanks for listening, everyone.
See you next week.